I will only say this once. Please leave my yacht. Catherine Davenport's voice was so cold it seemed to vacuum the sound from the air. The crowd, once buzzing with idle chatter, fell silent. A heavy, sudden stillness descended, freezing the space in an invisible frost. Elias Vance stood at the center of it all, a strange fish in waters long claimed by creatures who knew this sea. He didn't belong here, and they knew it. They felt it the moment he arrived. Catherine, the hostess, the gatekeeper of power, in every glance had passed her judgment. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't blink, didn't move. His silence wasn't submission. It was a quiet defiance. The gazes from the surrounding guests sliced through his pride like blades of glass, cutting into flesh that burned beneath the weight of scrutiny. But he didn't react. He stood there unmoving like a stone caught in the violent rush of a river made of whispers and stares. The chamber music, once melodic and warm, died mid-note, as if someone had sliced through the strings that held the room together. No piano, no violins, no subtle rhythm from the drums tucked somewhere behind velvet curtains. Nothing remained but the dull, mechanical beat of waves slapping the hull cold and repetitive like a clock counting down. The golden lights of the party no longer felt festive. They became spotlights on a stage, and at the center stood Elias, motionless, solitary, wrapped in a silence too loud to ignore. The brightness, nearly blinding, only amplified the absence of his place in this glittering world. He felt heat on the back of his neck, like someone breathing fire onto his skin. It crawled up, flushed his face. Every instinct told him to turn and walk away. But he didn't. That heat wasn't from the lights. It was the burn of tension, thick and stifling. In his mouth, a metallic taste rose, rage laced with humiliation, biting through every breath, every cell. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached. His fingers gripped the old-fashioned glass until the ice inside threatened to shatter. He stared into that cube of ice, the only cold thing keeping him grounded. The blur of the world faded. All he felt was the chill pressing against his skin, as if the glass were holding him together. But even that cold couldn't erase what he felt, that he was being cast out, labeled as something foreign, unworthy of this place. Every eye fell on him, not with awe, but with discomfort. He was a mirror reflecting all their quiet fears. The woman in the emerald silk gown turned away, creating a physical barrier. The man in the tailored suit and Patek Philippe glanced down at his watch, as if Elias's mere presence were wasting his time. Hidden phones began to flash under expensive blazers, shifting into recording mode. Each subtle movement, every raised brow, every shifting footstep cut deeper into his pride. Elias realized this wasn't a personal insult. It was a systemic condemnation, one delivered by an entire class, a world that had never considered him one of their own. Their gestures weren't isolated. They were synchronized instruments of exclusion. They branded him with a silent label, outsider. A memory surged, uninvited, a flicker from a past buried deep. 17-year-old Elias, in a cheap hoodie, followed step by step behind a store security guard on Madison Avenue. Every move monitored, every glance assumed guilt. Not because of what he did, but because of who he was. That feeling had never left him. Not even now, after success, after wealth, after achieving everything he had dreamed of. To them, he was still a stranger. Still not enough. His silence was resistance. A quiet war cry. He didn't walk away, didn't argue, didn't protest. He just stood there steady as storm clouds of judgment swirled around him. This invisible cage, crafted not from steel but from glances and whispers, was tightening. And still Elias remained upright. His silence held more weight than Catherine's words. In his eyes there was no fear, only a quiet defiance that sharpened the air like broken glass. Catherine stepped forward. Her perfume hit first sharp, deliberate a warning. "Security is on its way," she said louder now, as if that would seal the blow. But Elias didn't move. Stillness anchored him. He looked into her eyes, an unmoving island amid crashing waves. Catherine met his gaze but found no recoil. The silence, heavy as stone, locked her in place. The fact that he didn't flinch made everything more volatile. There was no going back. The invisible cage was closing in, and all Catherine could do now was wait, while the others stood quietly watching, holding their breath in the stillness of this moment. Catherine Davenport didn't need to glance at the guest list. She knew every name that mattered here, at least the ones who belonged, the ones from the right circles. The rest were irrelevant, uninvited, unworthy of standing in this space. And Elias Vance, no matter how much wealth or influence he might possess, was still an outsider in her eyes, a trespasser in a sanctuary built for people like her. That was why she had chosen to stage this spectacle, a performance of power rooted in exclusion. She looked at Elias, then lowered her gaze to the leather-bound iPad in her hands. Her fingers moved across the screen like a dancer's, each motion calculated, each swipe deliberately graceful. She wasn't actually searching for anything. She was performing the search like a queen surveying a criminal before passing judgment. "What did you say your name was again?" Her voice rang out sweetly but loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. Elias didn't answer immediately. He watched her calm and unhurried. He took a slow breath, steady, and responded clearly, firmly, without a flicker of doubt, "Elias Vance." Catherine held his gaze for a moment. There was no recognition in her eyes. She glanced back at the iPad, but didn't type in his name. Her fingers simply skimmed the surface as if the matter didn't warrant true attention. "Strange," she said, voice even but tinged with a hint of feigned concern. "I don't see your name on the official guest list. Perhaps you're part of the event staff." The words hit Elias like a blade, sharp, deliberate. It wasn't just a dig at his status. It struck at his race, his background, his entire existence. Her prejudice was wrapped in polished language, but to Elias, it couldn't have been more blatant. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional erasure. In her eyes, he wasn't a guest. He was a ghost, something that didn't belong in this space. Still, he didn't react. No anger, no outburst. He stood his ground in silence, feeling the weight of her words press against him. But no, he wouldn't take the bait. He was Elias Vance, and he had nothing to prove to anyone. From his jacket, he pulled out an invitation, embossed, elegant, a card that mirrored the luxury of this very gathering. He held it up to her, but she merely glanced at it, unmoved. She didn't even reach out, as though the card itself was beneath the dignity of the space. Then came her words again, soft but glacial, a slap cloaked in civility. "There must be some mistake," she said, a smirk frozen on her lips. "This is a private event." The security guard, a large man with a hardened expression, stepped forward. He was the embodiment of the system, the enforcer of the room's invisible boundaries. But his eyes flicked between Catherine and Elias, as if searching for a reason not to follow through on what he instinctively knew was wrong. He hesitated, motionless, as though frozen in a dilemma no training could resolve. The crowd began to murmur their voices like nervous sheep searching for cover. A hushed voice whispered from somewhere nearby, just loud enough for Elias to hear, "Just leave. No point making a scene." The words stung, not because of their volume, but because of what they revealed. These people wouldn't speak up. They wouldn't take a side. They clung to their own comfort, preferring peace over justice. They chose silence because it preserved their position. This was their society, a world where self-interest reigned, and those who didn't belong were erased without resistance. Catherine glanced at the guard and gave a slight nod. "Please escort him out." She didn't look back at Elias, didn't offer another word. Her gestures were cold, clinical, like brushing away an ant without leaving a trace. But Elias didn't move. He locked eyes with the guard, his gaze unwavering. It wasn't that he wasn't afraid, it was that fear wouldn't change the truth. He wasn't being removed. He had already been rejected by the very space he now stood in. What he needed was a moment, just one moment that could change everything, and he would wait for it. The silence stretched cruel and heavy. The crowd remained still, each person trapped in their own private calculation, but united in complicit stillness. Tension reached its peak. And then nothing. Just waiting. Waiting for something they couldn't predict. But everyone understood tonight would not end quietly. Catherine Davenport, who moments ago appeared to command absolute power, found herself standing on the edge of collapse. The silence, thick and inescapable, dragged on like a swamp, dense, heavy, and inescapable, until she could no longer maintain her composure. The sense of losing control began to show clearly on her face. Her fingers clutched the leather-bound iPad, tightly, hands trembling ever so slightly. That tight grip only highlighted the rising tension coiling inside her. In that silence, people could sense Catherine's fear, though she still refused to admit defeat. Eventually, her patience snapped. A smile formed on her lips, but it was nothing more than a paper-thin mask unable to hide the discomfort beneath. "People like you always find ways to sneak into places you don't belong," she said. The words, though not loud, struck like a lethal blow, an open wound, exposing the blood-stained prejudice in her core. "People like you," the way she said it, like a hammer smashing stone left behind, only the sound of truth breaking open. Time seemed to fracture. The silence no longer held the same weight, but it didn't give way to noise either. Instead, it left a void in the crowd, a gap, a clearing, where something irreversible had just happened. Heads turned sharply toward Catherine, as though wolves had caught the scent of wounded prey. Still no one spoke. No one needed to. Only their eyes now spoke, eyes that no longer masked their disgust, now freely piercing the skin of everyone still pretending not to notice. Catherine didn't yet realize what she had just lost. Not simply because she had let her prejudice slip, but because she had revealed the arrogance of someone who believed so completely in her own power, she couldn't see that it was her behavior, not Elias's, that had exposed her. Elias, who had remained silent the entire time, finally spoke. His voice wasn't raised, it wasn't rushed, but when he spoke, it struck the air like a thunderclap, low and steady and impossible to ignore. "This yacht was rented under my account." 5 words. Just 5. But they landed like a blow to the chest, heavy, final, and shattering. There was no need to explain further, no need to add a single word. The truth delivered so simply had the force of a tide washing away all illusion. Catherine stared at him, in her eyes disbelief, then fear. The color drained from her face like a vanishing tide, stripping away every layer of artificial composure she had left. Her hands, still clutching the iPad, now visibly shook, and that smirk, her signature look of superiority, cracked and fell away like shattered glass. She offered no defense, no excuse. She stood there engulfed in shame, drowning in the stunned horror of the crowd that surrounded her. Whispers began to spread like sparks across dry wood. The stares were no longer on Elias, they had shifted entirely to Catherine. Phones were raised, capturing it, recording it, sealing this moment into permanence. A man, the same one with the Patek Philippe, no longer looked at Elias. He now turned to Catherine, his face twisted with contempt, as if she were something he could no longer tolerate. That look alone said it all. She's not worthy of this place. Unable to endure it any longer, Catherine turned away, fumbling for her phone, like a drowning woman reaching for anything solid. Every press of her fingers on the screen seemed to echo her collapse. When she spoke, her voice cracked, panicked, nothing like the confident figure she had been just moments earlier. Yes, I understand. No, I assumed, I'll resolve it immediately. That final phrase, I assumed, rang out like a confession, a public admission of guilt. And in that moment, something broke that could never be rebuilt. The performance of power Catherine had carefully orchestrated crumbled entirely. No more smug confidence. No more command in her posture. All that remained was emptiness, gaping undeniable, and a room full of eyes now bearing witness to her ruin. She hadn't just tainted her name. She had poisoned the entire evening, turning what was meant to be a display of elegance into a theater of shame, a moment no one would forget. And in that moment, as Catherine hung up the call, as she dared to look once more at Elias, the man she had branded a stranger, an outsider, she finally saw it. He hadn't changed anything through confrontation or revenge. He had changed it through composure, through clarity. I was the only one in the room who didn't waver. Elias looked at her not with hatred, not with triumph, but with something far more cutting pity. Not the kind born from cruelty, but from finality. As if Catherine no longer posed a threat. As if she were no longer a player in this story, only a cautionary ending. And that Elias understood was all she was now. His silence was not forgiveness. It was the closing of a chapter, a story she had written herself. Catherine Davenport stood there a ghost among the crowd, as if the world had vanished from her eyes. Every trace of pride, every ounce of self-satisfaction she had meticulously crafted, now lay in ruins. The glittering light of wealth she once proudly wore had been stripped down to a paper-thin shell, no longer strong enough to shield her from the judgment radiating from those around her. Those who had once gathered around her now kept their distance. The looks once filled with admiration had soured into contempt, awe replaced by quiet shame. The cameras no longer pointed toward Elias, they had turned on Catherine, as if every flash from the lens was another public declaration of her collapse. Catherine remained frozen, unable to act, unable to speak. Her eyes darted helplessly around the room, locking onto each gaze now fixed squarely on her. There were no allies left. No one stood with her. She began to realize she had lost not just her standing at this event, but everything she once believed to be solid. The power she wielded had been torn from her hands in mere seconds. And yet within that painful moment, something else began to stir, something unfamiliar. Perhaps it was the silence stretching across the crowd. Perhaps it was the unnerving stillness of Elias. He stood where he was, unmoving, unhurried, simply watching. And in the way he stood, rooted, composed, unflinching, Catherine could feel a strength that transcended material power. He didn't need to lash out. He didn't need to retaliate. He only needed to be who he was. Marcus Thorne, Elias's business partner, stepped forward. He approached with a confident stride and placed a hand on Elias's shoulder with familiar ease, though his eyes couldn't hide the cold disdain he held as they briefly landed on Catherine. "Elias, I see you've gotten acquainted with the reception team," he said, his tone edged with irony but layered too with acknowledgement, recognition that Elias's place in this room was no longer in question. Marcus's words weren't just a joke. They were a statement. Elias hadn't just won this confrontation, he had risen above the entire structure Catherine once embodied. Elias didn't reply. He offered a slight nod, his gaze steady and calm, speaking volumes without a word. He didn't need to say more. The truth had already been laid bare. Power isn't something that can be bought. It is earned through integrity, through courage, through presence. And Elias understood in that quiet moment that he had passed a defining threshold. But more than reclaiming his rightful place, he was shifting the very rules of the game. Moments later, the tension in the room began to ease, though the atmosphere remained irreversibly altered. Elias walked calmly toward the small stage where the band had once played. He glanced across the room one more time, and all eyes followed him. He didn't need a grand speech, his presence alone demanded attention. He picked up the microphone not to shout, but to speak with deliberate clarity. His voice was low, firm, unwavering. For the safety and comfort of all future guests, I'll be meeting with the leadership of the Nantucket Foundation tomorrow morning. We will be reviewing the full screening process and staff training procedures for any events booked under their name. The words landed with precision, not just as a blow to Catherine, but as a direct challenge to the system she represented. Elias wasn't addressing one person. He was addressing an entire structure that had long ignored the quiet rot of bias and injustice. He was turning humiliation into a platform for change, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been silenced by that same system. The room didn't speak, but this silence was different. It wasn't tense. It was respectful, reverent even. The kind of silence that follows something undeniable. A man rose to his feet. A single clap rang out soft, at first almost hesitant. Then it spread. Without instruction, without a signal, applause began to ripple through the room. No one said a word, but everyone knew. Elias hadn't just disrupted a party. He had cracked something deeper, more enduring. He had shifted the foundation beneath them. When the crowd finally began to disperse, Elias walked past Catherine. She still stood where she had before, still diminished, a faint shadow in the very world she had once commanded. He didn't slow, but as he passed her, he paused just for a moment. Then he turned back, slightly, looked her in the eye, and said just loud enough for her alone, "A person's worth doesn't live on a guest list, Ms. Davenport. I hope you learn that." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't mockery. It was a simple truth. A truth Catherine had long refused to confront, but now it had been spoken, and it had already changed everything. Elias turned again, not looking back, and walked toward the door where the open night air waited to receive him. He didn't smile. There was no celebration in his stride, only weight. A quiet heaviness in his chest for the price it had taken to reach this moment. But he understood. Sometimes victory doesn't feel like joy. Sometimes victory feels like awakening. He stepped outside, and the night air touched his skin, cool and quiet. Moonlight fell across his face, and for the first time that evening he felt free. This story isn't just about power or vengeance. It's a lesson in resolve and in the quiet force of a truth that cannot be buried. When you stand your ground, when you know who you are, you realize that true strength doesn't come from wealth or titles, but from action, from dignity, from the quiet certainty of your worth. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to follow more powerful narratives from Story Precious. We're here to bring you stories that help you find your light even in the darkest hour.